Lorraine, welcome. For those watching, Lorraine Candy is a mother of four, and she's an award-winning journalist. She's got over a decade of experience writing about parenting for national newspapers and magazines here in the UK. I've literally followed her work for 20 years when she was, starting from when she was editor-in-chief at Elle magazine through to editor-in-chief at Sunday Times Style. And Lorraine, I've always been really, I've just really always admired the way that you've talked about, about women's issues and being fearless about talking about some of those aspects, of being a woman in the world that other people, haven't necessarily gone to over the years. And that's certainly true of your book on parenting that's just come out, and your podcast that explores the dynamic experiences of midlife. So would love for you just to share a little bit more about each of those and anything else that you would like to add.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Mia. It's quite it's a privilege to talk about my career and the amazing community of women around me, the Gen X women that seem to follow me. So I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. I left school at 16 and I went straight into newspapers. And then I exited that career, full-time career, 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and wrote a book, Mum, What's Wrong With You? 101 Things Only the Mothers of Teenage Girls Know, which is really about parenting all adolescents, but I focus on teenage girls because my eldest two children are teenage girls, and it was quite a shock when they became teenage girls. I just couldn't quite work out what was going on, so I sort of set out as a journalist to find out, so we could have a slightly more empathetic kind of mindset for ourselves as parents and for them as teenagers. And I also co-host a podcast called Postcards from Midlife, and it's about women really over 40, I guess. I co-host with Trish Halpin, who used to edit Marie Claire, Red, InStyle. So between us, we've edited most of the big magazines. Yeah. So yes, and that has actually been phenomenally successful, which I have to say was a slight, I mean, we've had millions of downloads. I mean, it's been huge. So we're really pleased because we just really set it up to get the message and information out there to midlife women about what was going on with their minds and bodies and brains. And, once you know that, information is power and knowledge is power, and you can lead a more magnificent midlife. So really my career has kind of covered women, right from teenage right the way through. And I know a lot of women at this stage have teenagers, and I know a lot of women at this stage are going through, I'm sure in the work for your brand as well, are going through so many biological changes that if we know about them, we can really help ourselves a little bit more. But I have to say, both Trish and I, A, we didn't know about the storm of teenagers, and B, we just had no idea about perimenopause and menopause, which, given we're journalists, was quite a shocking whole gap in our information.
Yeah, but I think, that's, so at NISA we talk a lot about the unmentionables, right, which are these things we all experience to some extent, but don't talk about enough. And when you started off, we had all had babies at the same time around 4 years ago, and that's the postpartum experience, right? Postpartum recovery, it's a huge one that is just, if you go into it not knowing what to expect, which most of us do, it makes the experience so much harder because you don't have the knowledge to know.
Well, yes, I mean, I last of my four children at 43, so I had the postpartum, perimenopause,
right,
and teenagers. So wherever there are hormones, I was into, there was an intersection of me in that area, and I thought it would be kind of unforgivable of me not to write about that for other women. Women of this generation are having children at various ages, so we are all going through this all the time. And there is an argument I notice sort of bubbling up not to be defined by our biology because it somehow shows a weakness, which I think, and it comes from some women actually, I think it perpetrates a really dangerous myth that we can't talk about ourselves. We are our biology, and if we know what's going on, we certainly know that the biggest growing sector of the workplace in the UK is women over 50, because we're staying in our roles much longer. So, but, if you're perimenopausal or menopausal, you might be experiencing dire symptoms of depression, which you can obviously alleviate with HRT and various other lifestyle changes. But if you don't know about it, you might step out of your job. And we've spoken to lots of women that have stepped out of their job thinking that they're going mad, and really very simple things they can do to change that and stay in these roles. So we should be talking about the unmentionables. We should be talking about our biology, you know, and we also know that the medical profession has been woefully ignorant around women's health at all stages, and seems to have some kind of mentality that we need to endure things, you know, that our pain threshold is somehow higher than men's pain threshold.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of new thinking around the brain at the moment and how that changes in midlife. And again, this has been largely ignored by the medical profession, which has been weighted much more towards, I mean, it has to be said, in a patriarchal society, to solving the problems of men as opposed to solving the problems of women. And somehow muting us, turning us down on talking about that is helpful for a patriarchal society. And we can't do that anymore. I certainly remember working at the Sunday Times, and when I first started writing about what women were going through, women would come up to me in the loo and say, "Can I talk to you quietly here?" And I'd say, "Why are we talking quietly here in the toilet?"
Yes,
you know,
broadcast this to the world and help other women.
That should be shameful. We've been taught to be ashamed of our bodies, what it goes through. We don't have the knowledge, so we've got confused, and we've been kind of a mindset where we keep that quiet, and that's just not fair, I don't think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the first stepping stone to that is all of us talking more loudly, sharing our stories, sharing information. I think
just share the information. We're not saying pity us, you know, worry about us, poor us. We're saying, can we sort this out so that we can be even more brilliant at what we're doing?
Yes, I love that. Well, okay, so let's start by talking about parenting, and then we'll get a little more into perimenopause. So two hefty topics, but let's get into it. So you write in the intro to your book, Mum, What's Wrong With You, that this is for curious mums who want to trust their teens to become independent and resilient themselves, for people who don't want to play into the narrative that teenage girls are deliberately grumpy, lazy, and hormonal. I just really love that. So what does being a mum who is curious mean to you?
I think the biggest lesson I learned from the book, and I interviewed many experts who were working in the front line of adolescent mental health for both boys and girls, is that sometimes we forget to listen to our actively listen. That's the therapist phrase, is active listening. To actively listen to our girls as they get older. We dismiss a lot of their worries and fears, and because their brains during teenage are being taken apart and put back together again, this is really new research that's coming out, they're in a bit of a jumble, and they're not thinking logically like adults, and we're expecting them to think logically. It's like when we say things, you know, when they get their heart broken, oh, well, there's be loads of boys, you're only young, blah, 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 blah. I mean, that's not listening to your teenager saying, this is where I'm feeling. It's not climbing into their place, even if you think it's silly and you know what's going to happen because you're an adult and you've been through that. And I think that's the bit about being curious. It's listening to them and not responding with, well, we can fix this by, or responding with, well, when I was a teenager, blah, blah, blah. So don't give them your story and don't tell them you can fix it. Just really, really listen and let them hand all of those feelings to you so that you can say, I understand how you're feeling. This must be terrible for you. Tell me more. So I think we've been slightly dismissive of our, we can be, not all of us, many parents aren't, but, you know, we can be, you know, and it's very difficult to talk to teenagers. They don't really want to share too much because they're separating from us. That's the point of the teenage years. So curious for me means really properly listening. And I think often mum takes on that role, perhaps, or the female caregiver takes on that role more so than dads and men around adolescent children.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time, you know, it's really just showing that you're there, right? To listen, to show compassion. You don't necessarily have to bring in your own context of your experience.
You don't have to solve everything. And we've been, you know, I think we've had 20 years of a more attachment parenting theory, which we've taken mistakenly carried through their childhood into their adolescence. You've really got to let them go a lot more and just listen to them as they come in and just be around for them rather than trying to solve all their problems, which is a really strong instinct for Gen X women. Yeah.
And that's, you know, letting go. I would imagine, my daughter's only 4.5, but I would imagine I'm already sort of preparing. That's why I really love reading your book, because it's sort of giving me the information.
You'll be letting go when she goes to school. I mean, every stage is a letting go. We often get into thinking that, you know, oh, well, we're in the stage, we can deal with it now. We're in this stage, this will be, and that these stages are so quick. The change is so constant, and it's one long letting go, really. But the more we cling on and the more we interfere and the more we try to control, the more difficult it can be for some teenagers.
Yeah, it's the kindest thing, isn't it, to do the work on our end.
It starts early, you know, it really starts at sort of,
well, like you're right, school.
And school.
What did you bring forward from your own experience being parented as a teen when it came to, parenting your own girls, and what did you sort of actively try to avoid repeating?
I think when you talk to all the experts, you do bring your own childhood into the room. You can't, it's unavoidable, your own patterns. I think what I learned was to step back a bit, because I had the privilege of interviewing these experts, and think, is this, I'm reacting in a certain way because that's how I was parented. I mean, I grew up in a very rural area, in a very small village. So my children have had they've had an inner city upbringing in London. I mean, we live right in the middle of London. So it's been quite a different experience for them. So, and my parents were let me be very, very independent, because I did leave Cornwall, where I grew up, to come and live in London when I was 16. So I can't imagine any of my 16-year-olds doing that. So I have had to sort of, I suppose, adapt and think, they may not be capable of all the things that I was as a teenager. They may be of a different mindset. I think that's the main thing you learn as well, is there's an amazing book called The Dandelion and the Orchid by Thomas Boyce, which is about the difference you have in how each child develops. So what may work with my older children might not, what worked with my 19-year-old daughter won't work with my 10-year-old daughter. She's a totally different personality. So I think I have to take that into account as well, as a parent, that their brains develop at a different stage. They're all very different. Some are a lot more fragile, perhaps, and I certainly, I have a very kind of sort of let's just get on with it attitude. I've managed big teams over the years, and that was brilliant parenting for my 19-year-old. Doesn't work for my 18-year-old. She's a very different mindset. She's a much more creative, different kind of child. So I've tried not to parent them in the same way, and I've noticed that some of my kind of can do doesn't really work with number two in the way it worked with number one. In fact, it's very frightening for her sometimes, I think. Yeah.
Well, that sort of leads to my next question, sort of going back a few years, but talking to like preteens about getting their period. We've just released a guide to establishing period positivity for teens with NISA. And you wrote in your book about starting to talk to your daughters around age 8 about their period. So I'm just curious, like, how did you frame up those conversations, and did you have to tailor it differently to each of your girls, given that they are so different?
Yeah, I think you have to be aware of the mindset and the kind of how, whether your child is a dandelion or an orchid in a kind of basic terms around that. But obviously I used to edit Cosmopolitan, so I'm very used to talking about, big, private, potentially embarrassing by society standards moments out loud. So it's not really been, I've been talking about sex toys since I was 22, so it's not really a big thing for me. I don't find it embarrassing, unlike with the previous question, my parents would never have talked about anything to do with sexuality or periods. It just simply wouldn't have been that generation's it
was kind of like, just figure it out for yourself,
sort it out yourself. Somebody at school will tell you about it. And we know that at school, because of the limitations and the kind of inbuilt conservativeness of this country, it really isn't talked about in the way it should be. It's so hit and miss. I knew that my teenagers were not getting the information they needed at school, so I found out the information. And because I think you have to stay modern and up to date with these things. There's a lot of websites I put in the back of the book, and yours is particularly helpful as well, with the correct information. And also, as a mum, you don't have to know everything, but you can find out things and give your daughter ways of sharing that. With my girls, very early on, we created a little package of things that I explained to them how it worked, and I showed them things. I mean, some children might find this a little frightening, so you have to do it in the stages that you feel work for them. And I waited for moments when I wasn't lecturing them, when we had space and time and wouldn't be interrupted, to sit and talk about it. And the other thing I did is I made my husband talk to the girls as well about periods, to show that it wasn't a shameful thing that only women could talk about.
I love that.
It was something that we could all talk about that. I have a son as well, a 15-year-old son, and he was included in the conversations, which obviously he found excruciatingly embarrassing,
but important when, you know, when he's
really important. I mean, embarrassing not because he was a boy, but embarrassing because he's quite a shy boy. So I think it's just constant small bits of information. I don't think you sit down and say, right, we're going to have the period talk, right, we're going to have the sex talk. You just sort of gradually
filter it in.
Well, and also tipping points, things on telly. We bought little books for the girls to, you know, get to know your body books. The only good ones were American ones, actually, we found. When there weren't any great ones here. They were very, very anatomical here. We never say vagina when we mean vulva. You know, I made very clear that the girls knew the difference between that. So I mean, they're very forthright, my elder girls, about it. We knew we used the right words, we picked the right time, and we were calm and patient about it. And I didn't feel I had to know everything, but I found out information for them, and they went to school at sort of 8 with these little makeup bags with the stuff in that they might need. I mean, 8 is very young, but I know certainly some of their friends have started their periods at 9 or 10.
Yeah. Well, actually the age for starting to menstruate is getting younger. So
much younger, yeah, I know. It's interesting, isn't it? And also I think the other thing that I felt I needed to know about is this kind of work when your brain is rebuilt and your hormones have it's like petrol in the brain. They have an incredible influence over how your neurology works. So I realized that I needed to do a bit of research on how that was going to affect my girls during their teenage years, because there is some statistics to show that if girls do exams when they're just before they menstruate, that it's really difficult for them to concentrate, much more difficult than from boys. So I had all of that, and I would be mindful of saying to the girls, are you feeling okay? How are you? You know, maybe keep a record of how you're feeling. Get to know. There's a very brilliant book called Period Power by Maisie Hill, which gives you really all the facts on the cycle and how it affects you from a very scientific and biological way, and where you might be not metabolizing nutrients, etc. So it's really important, you know, that, and that we give, you know, when girls say, I just can't focus today, that we don't dismiss that we listen to that, and also that we look out for the early signs of female health issues, because often the way your female health is in your teenage years is reflected in your midlife years as well. And we don't keep a kind of focused record of women from the moment their hormones start arriving to the moment their hormones start disappearing. If we had that body of work and doctors were taught to join all that up, we could be much more preventative about female health.
Yes, absolutely. And you wrote something in your book that really resonated with me. It was the assumption that women, even as teens, need to put up with pain. It, you know, is unhelpful to say the least. And that misinformation and lack of information about our, you know, bodies continues to be persistent.
Well, some of the signs of pain in teenage years are early signs of endometriosis, which obviously we know we can.
PCOS.
Yeah.
Right. And then, you know, you have these symptoms when you're a teenager, then not being diagnosed correctly, you're not being listened to by your doctor. And then, you know, I speak to women all the time where it's like 15, 20 years later that they've been dealing with this. And then they could have had some strategies to help with pain, you know, all of that.
There is a default setting in the medical profession for us to endure pain. We had Professor Michael Baum, who's the leading, I guess he's the world's leading breast cancer surgeon. He was involved in inventing tamoxifen to help breast cancer patients, and his mum died of cancer. And he said that when his mum was being treated, he would go onto the ward and look at the levels of pain relief women were getting, and they were significantly lower than the levels of pain relief men suffering from cancer were getting. He would go and turn all morphine drips up, you know, and he said there is a societal expectation for us to put up with awful cervical smear pain, for us to, you know, to put up with all of this when actually we really don't need to. And being told by doctors at 15 or 16 to take Nurofen when you might have early signs of PCOS is really unforgivable. And we just need to keep calling it out and know the information. Once you know, a GP told us, a brilliant GP told us, if you go into a surgery, there are 2 people in the room who know about your health, you and the doctor. So take your health seriously, give them the information, know as much as you can, and challenge what you're being told in a kind and empathetic way.
Yes, yeah, and I also want to add that that default higher pain setting, that's assumption is even worse for Black women, right? There's a
it's
persistent
absolutely
narrative.
shocking for Black women. They are expected to endure the most appalling pain, particularly during childbirth and labour as well. It's just a chunk of society really completely whose voices are completely ignored, and it is a shame. And we have got to start calling it out all the time. And I always say to women, if they're worried, or go with your daughters to the doctor, or go with your friends to the doctor, or take someone with you, so that you have two of you in there saying, we know that statistically I'm more likely to be prescribed this when I should be being prescribed this, or I'm more likely to be told this when I should be, have the facts, because they're medical people and they should take notice of the facts.
Yes, well, that leads me to the point of sort of training teens to be able to self-advocate. Like, what are some of the things that you try to do with your daughter? I think that's a great one. Is like, if you're going to the doctors, if you're having a first gynecological exam, like bringing somebody in who can also advocate with you, I think is great. Particularly
young Black teenagers, because young Black girls are really, their voice is not heard at all. And there's a society, there's a lot of research on this, where young Black women are expected to be much more mature than they are for their age. So often they're really ignored. So it would, if you can go in with your teenage daughters, young Black girls, their voices are not listened to at all.
You've written about the complexity of navigating body image issues with young girls, and you believe being silent about our bodies, at least in front of them, is actually one of the wisest strategies. So could you say more about why it's important for young women not to hear body commentary from their mothers?
I think this is just it's a conflict for us all as women, because obviously all our bodies, we are very aware of how they look and feel, and how society judges them, and how we judge them, and what's healthy as well, from a body image, weight, shape perspective. But if we could say nothing, that would be the best about their way they look. If we do, stop calling them beautiful, apply no value to how your body looks. Now, obviously, that's just impossible. And really, I found it very hard, but we are the biggest role model for our teenage daughters. So our daughters anyway, throughout our whole life. So, they are looking at us constantly and seeing how we react and what upsets us, and what they're absorbing that as their brain is being built. So we need to kind of take a moment and be mindful of that, and kind of put value in them for other things, for how their joy and their happiness and what they're doing, and not valuing their achievements either, because that can often lead to a dangerous kind of addiction to perfection, which is coming through a lot, actually, particularly now post-pandemic. Teenage girls, they're putting an enormous pressure on themselves to achieve. If we can just be non-judgmental around all of it and not make it part of our conversation, that would be helpful. Now, obviously, we've all moaned about ourselves putting on weight and what we look like and how we're changing and things, so that's not helpful. If we could try and avoid that, that would be good. Or recognize in front of them that we know that that's not healthy. But I think also give ourselves a bit of a break. I interviewed a young woman who's a writer, Honey Ross, in the book, who'd had quite a struggle with her weight over her whole childhood, and that had actually been put on a diet by her parents and given a personal trainer, all of it coming from the absolute best possible place to help her. But it was this fixing thing that default that we have. And actually she's realised, and she's very close to her parents, and they've been wonderfully supportive, that it's really the best thing would for it not to have been part of her conversation, the conversation around her growing up. If it could have been, as long as she was healthy, if it could have been ignored, that would have been better and helped to be more resilient. Really, to apply no value to what young girls look like is the best.
Yes. And to your point, not commenting on the things that we're unhappy about with our bodies, or even happy, just don't have it be part of the conversation.
Keep it to yourself. Just say it in your bedroom.
Okay, so let's shift to talking about perimenopause and menopause a bit more, because even if people watching this think, I'm not at that age point yet, we're all heading there, and having children of any age during that time possesses its own poses its own unique set of challenges. So what advice do you wish that you had had going into perimenopause, in addition to needing?
Well, I think I wish I'd known what it was, which would have been really helpful. So the perimenopause is the 10 to 12 years before the menopause. The average age of menopause in the UK is 51. It's 52, I think, in America, parts of Europe. So in that, most of your symptoms of your hormones go into complete fluctuation as they gradually decrease. So you can be full of it 1 month, and the hormones are estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. Those are the three main hormones. So in your late 30s, you should be thinking about, you should be arming yourself with the knowledge, what are the possible things that could happen when my hormones start fluctuating and gradually disappear, because that's gradually what's going to happen over that 10. Now, there are up to 40 symptoms of the perimenopause, and they can range from bizarre things like tinnitus through to severe psychosis and depression, because estrogen is powering your brain, and when it disappears, your brain can't work, and it dumps a load of information, hence the brain fog, hence the depression. Now, 2/3 of women are wrongly prescribed antidepressants in perimenopause, because one of the main symptoms is feeling just awful and feeling like you're losing yourself. The highest rate of suicide for women is between 45 and 49, which is not a coincidence. So all of this has been missed. So if you know that's coming, you might have a family history. It's worth knowing what your mum went through and your grandmother went through during her menopause as well. And it's worth keeping a record of all the female health issues you may have faced that could be hormone related during childbirth and after having your children, so you can sort of join up the dots, because it's all about fluctuating hormones. As we know with childbirth, it's fluctuating hormones. You can lose your hair, your skin will change. You can get osteoporosis, the beginnings of osteoporosis. There are so many symptoms. So arm yourself, find out about the symptoms. There is a doctor called Dr. Louise Newson, who I would say is probably the world's leading expert. We had her on the podcast very early on menopause and perimenopause. She's a GP. She treats women every single day. She saves lives, is what I would say. Hormone replacement therapy, which is when you replace the three hormones with body identical, so they are naturally made out of yams, will stop the majority of these symptoms. And it is so much safer. In fact, for women under 60, body identical HRT has no risk of breast cancer. So, and there are vaginal pessaries as well, estrogen pessaries, other ways of taking it. There are some women who can't take it, and those who've had estrogen positive breast cancer can't take HRT. But it is that the risks are so low compared to there was a very terrible study done 20 years ago of women over 60 using a different form of HRT, which has really blighted the whole of all the research on it. So I would say find out the facts on HRT, go to your doctor. The NHS recommendations are it is the first line of defense for any perimenopause symptoms. There is no test for perimenopause, because what your hormones are today will be totally different tomorrow, and unless you can compare that to the day they started when you were 14, there is no test. So don't be told, oh, we'll do a test on your hormones. That's not what's happening. It's a test on other things. Now, the other thing about HRT, which is really important, is it's a preventative medicine. So it will stop you getting osteoporosis. It prevents heart disease and dementia. So if you are able to take it and you're not taking it, you're putting yourself at risk of those diseases. There's a big documentary coming out on Monday, May the 2nd, on Channel 4 about how the brain is affected by menopause and perimenopause, and lack of HRT, lack of your hormones. The earlier you start taking HRT, the less the effect on your brain. So that, again, that new research is going to show how beneficial it is to women. So really, there are also lots of lifestyle changes that you can make. You know, exercise is the single most effective way of helping the symptoms. And that can be anything. And you have to do a slightly different, more weight-bearing based exercise in your 40s and 50s. So if you know that's coming, and sleeplessness is the worst, you know, the sleeplessness in perimenopause it is as bad as the sleeplessness of babies. It's suddenly back in your life again, and often you've got teenagers at that point, and they only ever want to talk to you at sort of post 10:30 at night. So it's, if you know all this information, you and it's all on the NHS website, then you're going to be thinking about it in advance, and you might change your lifestyle slightly as you come out of your 30s, which will really set you up for a way better journey than perhaps the one that my generation have had.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned the book Period Power by Maisie Hill, but she also has Perimenopause Power, which is a fantastic book
which
as
is
well.
very scientific, really scientific, because there's dietary things you can do. The way your body metabolizes food is very different during your 40s than your 30s. So there will be certain things you can't eat. I mean, I developed a really severe allergies at the beginning of my 40s, which is down to the way my body was processing histamines, which is which is controlled by estrogen. So it's kind of, where your hormone, your estrogen is in you have receptors in every single part of your body. So the moment it fluctuates, it affects the way your whole body works. So if you know it, you're not going to be sort of standing, sitting in a car crying, thinking, why have I got depression? And what's wrong with me? I can't walk properly anymore. I can't hear. I've got migraines. All of those things that women have told us on our podcast. You can alleviate a lot of that before it starts if you can get in the right mindset and the information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And how you had your youngest child when you were 42?
33. Oh yes, well 43. My first child at 33 and my final child at 43. Yeah.
I'm curious how, and then started perimenopause too,
probably about 47, 48 started perimenopause, but I think the symptoms had started before then.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, like, that must have been just such a sort of wild time, right? Because you have, going through postpartum, having that hormonal upheaval, but then also, the beginnings of perimenopause at that time.
I think it's overwhelming. I think women feel really overwhelmed, because I had one of the symptoms I had in my later 40s was I couldn't I felt I had dementia. I thought I couldn't remember. I got into the car and I couldn't remember which side of the road to drive on. It didn't make sense to me, and I thought there's something I've either got a brain tumor or something's gone wrong. And that makes you very, very scared when you have children and a big job. And, I just thought, I can't have them in the car with me if I can't remember things like this. So I started to curtail my life around it. Yeah. Until, obviously I was waiting for an MRI scan to see what was wrong with me. And it really wasn't, if I'd known a bit earlier, I think I would have avoided a lot of heartache. And, I had I had a toddler as well, sort of 5-year-old as well. And it's really hard to deal with that, I think, if you don't have the information. Obviously now I would have gone through a much more, knowing what I know now, I would have been straight to the doctor. And I think, because for me, within 2 or 3 weeks of taking HRT, I was back in the room again and I was fine.
Yeah. And how would you recommend, if somebody suspects that they have, you said that these kind of hormone tests don't work.
You keep a track. There's a tracker called the Balance app. Most of my teenagers keep a tracker of everything now. They've got an app that tracks their cycle, so they know that, so if you keep a track of the symptoms and you write them down, there's a list on the nice NHS website. If you're ticking off more than 3, then you take that to the doctor and say, this is what I think is going on.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I love about your podcast, Postcards of Midlife, is that you really make a point of celebrating how powerful and liberating this phase of life can be, right? I think that is something that's
amazing
not talked about enough, right? That it can be very joyous. So what are some of the positive experiences that you've had during this period of life, and what words of sort of comfort might you offer to others who maybe feel overwhelmed at the thought of kind of going in to that phase?
I think it's been given such a bad rap, the menopause, the perimenopause. So once you have harnessed your hormones and realized that you don't have to be, particularly I think in the later years of perimenopause and menopause, so in your 50s, once you start to realize you're not mothering in the intense extreme way that you were before, perhaps you could step back and get more time back to yourself. Getting the time back is just amazing. And then you have those moments of reinvention. We have had so many amazing women on the show who have reinvented their life, who've taken up whole new careers, women who have been at home and been mums who've been at home and then become doctors, GPs. They've go through all the medical training. You are very focused in midlife. You are very aware of how much time you have left, and the fragility of life becomes really evident to you, which makes you sharper and more focused. Yeah. You really couldn't care less what people think. I mean, I think that's the main thing. You're not defined by your sexuality anymore, and actually women can have a tremendously amazing libido surge in midlife once they get the hormones sorted. And that's fantastic as well. You're a sexual being within yourself rather than because of what you look like or how you've been packaged and valued by society, which is phenomenal. I think the opportunities are just amazing. You have a little bit more freedom. I mean, obviously, a lot of women are dealing with parents dying at this stage as well. So you are beginning to look at your own mortality, and you are quite organized. I think the real liberation comes in your 60s, though. I think that's what a lot of women have told us is when you just are free of quite a huge chunk of your responsibilities, hopefully by that point. I've interviewed a lot of women for a book I'm writing about midlife women, and the main theme that seems to be coming through from this generation is we were very hard on ourselves. We had a huge ambition to achieve and be the best mothers in the world. And actually, when we start to get older, we start to give ourselves a break and show a bit more vulnerability. And I think I would encourage all women in their kind of late 30s, early 40s to start in showing that vulnerability, and just also accepting that not everything's going to work out, not everything's going to be great. You know, some days are better than most, and to make time for yourself, because I think women, maybe millennials not so much, actually feel slightly guilty about, we would never as a generation have said, I can't do that, it's bad for my mental health. We just wouldn't have said it. We just said it's bad for my mental health, but I'll just do it anyway. And I think millennials, perhaps your generation, are a little bit more, that's too much work for me to take on, that's too late for me to work. You know, we have worked very much in a society created for muchly benefiting men. If women had created it, we wouldn't have made it in this format. And this format, it doesn't work for us at all. So if we created it equal, I think it would have been better. So, and I've interviewed a lot of women in their 50s who are really high flyers in massively powerful jobs across the world. And they have worked within the confines of a financial institutions set up to work for men who aren't going off to have children, etc., etc. So if we'd created it better, it would be easier for us. And I think when you get to midlife, you start to think, so what would be easier for me? How could I make this my day-to-day role better? How could this daily being be easier for me? And shall I not take on quite as much responsibility and give myself a break? And, that's what I mean about letting your teenagers let go. I talk to lots of mums who are still sort of organising their kids in their 20s, and perhaps they should let go because that gives them the freedom.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing in this space, because I am in my late 30s. I feel, because I am being able to have the knowledge by listening to your podcast, just really this conversation starting to come out more and more, I feel more prepared for it, and I actually feel quite excited for this.
It's really exciting. It's like when you're at the end of your teenage and you're just going to uni or coming out of uni thinking, what will I do with this bit of my life? And you're thinking in midlife, what will I do? The parenting phase is hard. It's really, it's just joyous, and there is a lot of grieving for that, because it's sad when you're not tucking them into bed. It's sad when you're not reading stories. Treasure those small moments, put your phone away, be in the room, make the rituals, keep it all together throughout the childhood, and watch them be independent. And it is sad to say goodbye to that, but on the other side, it's space and time that you can devote to yourself and your partner and your friendships, because female friendships are really important later in life.
Yes. And I love you've written about your discovery of cold water swimming, right?
Yes.
In this phase, and I love that, a whole new community.
Think of your adventure. What will your adventure be? Because everything is possible, because we live so much longer and we can be much healthier as we live that life.
Yes, I love that. What will your adventure be? Lorraine, thank you so much.
Thank you.